Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual roundtable event organized by the Center for Asian Legal Studies in collaboration with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the National University of Singapore, as well as the University of Liverpool. My name is Jaclyn, and I'm the Director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies. We're very pleased today to be able to host this event, which really is a celebration as well of a book edited by George Radics and Pablo Ciocchini on criminal legalities in the Global South. Now, you will hear more about what this book is all about and comments from contributors to this book. But I just want to sort of emphasize how important it is that this book investigates our assumptions and our embedded ideas about criminal law as well as criminal behaviors, and how the differences in the way we think about law, about legal order, and our perceptions about morality often also is shaped by these laws, which sometimes, at least in the context of common law Asia, may not have been developed within the local context, but were transplanted from different jurisdictions. So today, we have Professor Andrew Harding, who is really one of our sort of valued member of the Center for Asian Legal Studies. He's a research professor with us, and of course, the founding director of the center. And he will be moderating today's session. And I will now hand it over to him to introduce the speakers, the editors of this session today. Andrew, on to you.
Thank you very much, Jaclyn, and welcome to everybody. Thank you all so much for coming along to this seminar. We have about 30 people in the room, which is really, really great. And one of the advantages of having these virtual seminars is that we can reach so many more people than we could if we were all simply in the same room. So as you will have gathered, this seminar is really in the form of a kind of book panel, and I want to also really congratulate very sincerely George and Pablo on editing and producing this book. I remember having conversations with them about this project some time back, and it's great to see it now coming to fruition, and such a very impressive and interesting book it is too. And I think it also in a way represents a kind of a turn in scholarship on these issues, because I don't recall seeing a book on this topic at any point in my career thus far, criminal legalities in the Global South. I think it represents a turn in the sense of we're taking the Global South much more seriously these days, and also in terms of law and society study, trying to critically analyze how the law actually works in practice, as Jaclyn was saying just now. I mean, there is clearly a big gap between how the law is supposed to be and how it is in practice. So I think in both of these senses, this is a really important and very original and interesting contribution. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. And I want to also thank the presenters. We've got three other contributors to the book. We've got Jayson, Julieta, and Carolina, you'll see on the screen, and they are going to share with us their thoughts and their contributions to this book. So we're going to first of all hear from George and Pablo, so general introduction to the book. We'll then have 5 presentations where the 5 people I've mentioned will spend about 10 minutes each reflecting on the book. And then we will have the opportunity for about half an hour of Q&A at the end of that. Now, I'm not proposing to waste time introducing all of these great people. Their biodata is on the program, but they will just give a very short statement of their own identity and position, so that we're not taking time away from the the Q&A. So no disrespect to anybody intended, but I think that's a sensible way to proceed. So without further ado, let me hand over to George and Pablo, and if you can keep this introduction to 5 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. George, Pablo.
Thank you. George, do you mind if I start? So thank you all for being here. I would like to especially thank Jaclyn, Neo, and the Center of Asian Legal Studies, and Andrew, and also Julieta, Carolina, and Jayson. I know this the time differences makes this somewhat complicated for some, so I really appreciate the effort made by Julieta from Argentina. So I just wanted to say a bit about. I want just to say a bit about the backstage of the book, trying to make some points about some of the challenges that we face with George for getting this book. So key points that we all talk about. As Sandra was saying, we are more and more talking about decolonization, global South, and so on. But there are some issues, some challenges that we face when we actually want to work with the global South, and some of these is as we're speaking now, not just the time difference, but also it's about how distance suddenly becomes very apparent. So we are used to discuss and to feel that because of the advance of technology and so on, we are closer and it's easier. But when we actually try to produce proper meetings, face-to-face meetings, with George, we have been facing the problems of budget, the problems of difficulties that makes and making hard decisions about what language are we going to use, where are we going to meet, how are we going to meet. So we have been organizing panels in the Law and Society Association and the Research Committee of Theology of Law meetings, trying to put together panels with people from all over the world. We have been quite successful, but that has meant also that we have to fight for money and financial assistance from our institutions and other institutions in the global north. So the book, in a sense, tries to, for us, it was a way to consolidate all the effort of all these years. Since 2014, we have been trying to create a dialogue, sub-dialogue with people from us, far from Bangladesh and Peru, and I think in that sense, the satisfaction of seeing the book and trying to see this dialogue. This dialogue has, we can argue that one of the points here is that sometimes it's difficult to find common grounds, because exactly what we're trying to bring here is diversity, and that diversity means that it's very difficult sometimes to find common concepts and discussions. But if you go through the chapters of this book, what you're going to see, and I think it's going to be very clear once the presenters are presenting their own chapters, is that there are common topics that comes again and again and again, and also there are differences that also comes here. And I think that in this is one of the points that we're trying to do here when we're talking about legalities and self-just law and talking about the global South is that we are trying to bring together these issues so we can see that we are not trying to construct another universal, an alternative universal from the universal that has been or trying to be imposed from the global north. And what we're trying to do is try to make this diversity to speak and to find that in this context, we can see histories that they have common grounds, but still, and structural conditions that shape some of our perceptions of that law, but still there is always some level of diversity that we need to embrace and to meet, and that particularism, specificity, that's important to understand how this goes. So I don't want to spend more time on this because I think this is a point, trying to find diversity and at the same time trying to find common grounds. And I think the chapters are going to speak by itself. So I just leave the ground for for George or for the rest of the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. I think you've said everything beautifully. I think maybe we can move on to the presentation so that we have enough time for Q&A and for your wrap up as well towards the end.
All right, so I'm Jayson Lamchek. I'm a research fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be among you today to celebrate the launch of this wonderful book. The reform of criminal law codes is normally a boring topic and not often discussed outside legal academia. But in September 2019, when this book was still hot off the press, in Indonesia, the topic grabbed headlines for a while. This was because there were violent clashes in Jakarta between protesters, mostly students, and police over proposed changes to the Indonesian Penal Code. Recalling protests in Hong Kong at that time, which was also led by students. On TV, police were shown hurling tear gas and firing water cannons at protesters. Protesters were hurling firebombs. The gates of Parliament were burning. Hundreds were arrested. Now, the proposed revision of the Penal Code would have criminalized various activities from consensual sex outside the marriage to the dissemination of information on contraception, to the criticism of the present government. The protest prompted President Jokowi to halt the approval of the draft law by Parliament. And Shell, viewed in the context of political developments on which the national media has reported, the protests constitute a pushback against Islamic conservatism. Beyond the immediate political context of these events, however, there are even deeper historical roots to the troubles of criminal law and justice that we should also consider. The historical context provides us a kind of longer-term perspective, which is also a decolonial or anti-colonial perspective. The proposed change to the Penal Code is actually part of a bigger project to overhaul both the substantive and procedural aspects of Indonesia's criminal law. My chapter in the book focuses on the Code of Criminal Procedure, and I tried to answer the question why that code survived the avalanche of reform efforts during Reformasi. Now, the Global South, Pablo and George emphasize, is a heterogeneous collection of geographically dispersed countries. What is common among them is that they are all still suffering from the problems wrought by colonialism. I think this definition of the Global South is so apt for Indonesia, and its criminal justice system clearly illustrates the continuing legacy of colonialism in that country. The most problematic features of Indonesia's criminal justice system, namely the unusual powers of police and the relative weakness of the prosecution and judiciary in comparison to the police, express colonial era belief in the need to discipline and in the undemocratic control of a unsophisticated population. The persistence of these features of the criminal justice system, deep entrenchment of colonial legacies in official culture and in society. As an illustration of extreme judicial weakness, consider how Sebastian Pompe's book, The Indonesian Supreme Court, A Study in Institutional Collapse, described judges during the Suharto era. Pompe said the Justice Department and other high officials in the executive branch routinely gave Indonesian judges written orders regarding how they should decide cases. Many judges in this situation, and in order to show that their hands were tied, they quoted politicians' instructions in the very text of their judgments. And this is why we know this. The extreme weakness of the judiciary is no doubt a product of Suharto's authoritarianism. Suharto, in turn, had built on the authoritarianism and integralist ideology of Sukarno's guided democracy, which in turn built on the Dutch system. Judging by the law they applied to the natives, the Dutch colonists had very little regard for the rights and liberties of the population and preferred to control crimes among the natives through strong care forward through to post-colonial Indonesia by Sukarno and Suharto and beyond. Ironically, these post-colonial Indonesian governments often espouse nationalist rhetoric to make it appear that they reject the colonial legal inheritance, while in fact perpetuating its logic and spirit. Even today, Indonesian law students are told, for example, that the Indonesian Code of Criminal Procedure is, quote-unquote, a piece of Indonesian legal thought, supposedly significantly improving the era code by making it more humane and reflective of Indonesian values. In truth, the present code hardly improved on the colonial era code and preserved the premise that Indonesians were not ready for a cumbersome system of due process rights and liberties and must still be governed from police. In the democratic era, there was a call over the criminal laws, both substantive and procedural. There's a recognition that reforms are overdue, that the laws must reflect more current values. The last time the Code of Criminal Rights was during the Suharto era in the 1980s, while the Penal Code only saw minor revisions in 1940s and stands in almost identical form as its 1918 version. In my chapter on procedure, I emphasize that the proposed reforms would have constituted a due process revolution because the changes it tried to introduce were thoroughgoing and progressive by President V.Dr. in 2014. Now, some sort of lessons about future reforms can be drawn from what happened to the Code of Criminal Procedure. Draft revised code reflects the desire for greater respect for human rights in the criminal justice system. Main protagonists who had pushed for the proposal were elite actors, namely legal experts, reformers within and outside the Indonesian government and Western governments who assisted the reformers in its drafting. They were eventually thwarted by status quo forces deftly employing populist rhetoric. Perhaps what had been lacking was a broad mass-based movement for greater rights and liberties that also resisted populism. The protests in September 2019 are significant in this regard. There wasn't this sort of popular mobilization in support of the due process revolution when the draft revised Code of Criminal Procedure was being deliberated in Parliament in 2013. The challenge for reformers is to consolidate the protesters into a broad mass-based movement to legislate thoroughgoing reforms that would begin to truly break from the colonial and authoritarian past. Now, that's truly hard work.
Have you finished, Jayson? I wasn't quite sure. Okay, thank you very much. You've actually gained 3 minutes on us, which is really excellent. So let me now hand it over to Julieta and for your presentation, please, 10 minutes. Thank you, Julieta.
Okay, good morning, my time, good afternoon. I'm a research fellow at Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, an International University of Mar del Plata in Argentina. It's a great pleasure for me to share this moment with all of you. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. And also I would like to especially thank to Pablo and George for this opportunity to be part of this wonderful book. I have my copy here and a project. I would like to begin my presentation by sharing a few words about the research behind my book chapter. It was part of my doctoral research on social sciences, and the fieldwork was conducted with an ethnographic methodology. It was certainly a significant challenge to develop a social science research on law and to research about lawyers and criminal law when I was a sociologist. I made efforts to enter to the field to find the places where I could develop a participant observation and to start to follow the actors. This is like a key from the anthropology to recover their voices and understand their technical and slang words. All of that in order to explain with a distance and reflexivity what the federal procedural criminal reform means. The chapter presents the arduous process of federal criminal procedural reform pursued by a group of Argentine legal experts whose work has impacted the transformation of criminal codes, not only in Argentina, but also across Latin America. This reform is highly significant because it concerns the rules governing proceedings for judging federal crimes such as crimes against humanity, counterfeiting of money, trafficking in human beings, drug dealing, terrorism, and corruption. Starting for the end of the last military dictatorship in 1983, the reformative movement becomes very influential and persists along successive democratic governments to the present. So much of its development has been plagued with disputes. The reformers consider that a democratic and respectful of human rights justice systems requires legislative changes to implement more accusatorial or adversarial elements that centrally promote oral proceedings, the role of the prosecutor with persecutorial functions, and trial by jury. In the face of this dispute between the inquisitorial and the accusatorial paradigm, the theoretical methodological focus facilitates an understanding of the actor's cosmologies, or ideal representation of the social order. The anthropologist Mary Douglas argues that the concept of cosmology can be useful as a tool that agents use to discern, analyze, and or valorize reality. The use of cosmologies becomes especially necessary when anomalies are presented in the moment that agents identify as out of the natural order. The chapter identifies and describes the diverse cosmologies that the reformers have used in their public positions to criticize the Levene Code from 1991 for its inquisitorial system remains, and to promote a code reform to achieve their solution for the legal system, though their version of an accusatorial system. In particular, this chapter outlines the four most significant cosmologies that emerge from the speeches, interviews, and documents prepared by reformers engaged in the federal criminal procedural reform movement, which are, first, the strengthening of human rights and democratization, second, humanization of criminal justice, third, pursuit of the great crime, and lastly, modernization and the overcoming of old and obsolete. Due to time constraints, I'm going to share with you only the first one. A fundamental pillar of the reformer speech is anchored in the respect for human rights, particularly the rights enounced in the Argentine Constitution and in the international treaties. The recognition and promotion of human rights is linked with the ideology of the democratization Argentine's criminal justice system and the necessity of legislative change after an authoritarian regime. This narrative reproduced the ideological position that justice should be central in a democratic nation. Julio Mayer, one of the main reformers and author of a federal criminal procedural code project, highlights what he considers to be the need to carry out judicial reforms once democratic institutions were reestablished after the last military dictatorship in Argentina. To reinforce this position, Mayer emphasizes the relevance of the legal transformation and justifies it as a demand, indeed even a historical necessity, and the rebuilding of the country. In this line of thought, he expressed that recent example demonstrates this statement. Any honest person who knows how the national procedures work knows that some current trials of great public importance will never be resolved under the procedure of the code in force, and a decision will be delayed indefinitely, a situation which Argentine society should not tolerate. He said that in 1987. It is clear that Meyer allusions to a current trial of great public importance is in reference to the case 13 of the year 1984, known as the trial of the military juntas. The verdict that sentenced the commanders was read on 9 December 1985 by the President of the National Criminal and Correctional Appeals Court of Capital Federal, Judge Leon Arslanian, in the courtroom of the Palace of Justice. It should be stressed that this criminal trial served as a landmark case in the fight against impunity in case of massive violations to human rights, and has been taken as a model of justice in the transitional processes to democracy elsewhere. The trial to the military juntas was the first oral trial to take place for a federal criminal crime in Argentina, notwithstanding the retail procedure system enforced during that time for the civilian courts. Having an oral trial, despite the written procedural system in force, could be explained in two ways. First, the oral trial was possible only because the procedure had already been allowed under the Code of the Military Justice. Second, the trial has initially been intended for the prosecution of the military members by their own cooperation, but this did not happen. Due to the delay and the unwillingness of the military justice to proceed, the civilian court decided to take over the case. Meyer considered this oral trial indispensable for the transparency of the judicial process, which in turn was important, as Argentines sought justice for the massive crimes of the recent past and the reconstruction of the democratic system. I would like to add a few words in conclusion. The cosmologies noted earlier demonstrate that disputes concerning the reform of the federal criminal procedural system go beyond the law. The struggle is not only to replace the inquisitorial system, but directed against the inquisitorial culture that it generates. Through this lens, disputes and controversies proceed from the assumption that there is an intense need for cultural change. Reformers' speeches underscore that culture is a key factor for true transformation in the criminal justice system, which in turn will return respect of human rights and the true democratization of the country. Moreover, the same legal experts affirm that the real reforms will only be successful when it promotes a cultural change in both the code and the legal practice. The question remains whether legal research on justice reform takes into account that the studies on the practice of law needs to go beyond the law and could find support in other social sciences. This research affirms that criminal justice reform in particular could benefit from this type of analysis, especially because it concerns a dispute of power and affects society in a meaningful way. Thank you so much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Julieta, for your very interesting presentation. And of course, we're getting the idea that this book goes way beyond the formal law with a subtitle, Cultural Dynamics, Political Tensions, and Institutional Practices. So I think we're getting some great insights into those three aspects. And you may wish to note, those of you watching this, that the book is divided into three parts reflecting those three different approaches that I just mentioned. Okay, well, let's move on to Carolina Yoko Furusho, and we would like to hear about your contribution to this book. Carolina, over to you, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, George and Pablo. So I'm Carolina Furusho. I'm a fellow at Open Society Justice Initiative. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not speaking on behalf of Open Society. This book chapter was written during my PhD fellowship in Culture and Global Criminology, in which I researched international human rights courts in vulnerable groups. And both my research and this chapter were inspired by the power of concepts. So concepts such as vulnerability, crimmigration, concepts that prop up narratives and sustain or change patterns, both in law, in politics, and also in culture in general. So going at it, this chapter is based on some of the rulings of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which I researched during my PhD. In its case law, you see repeated condemnations of the Dominican state for human rights violations against people of Haitian descent. So the Dominican state has been known for perpetrating discrimination, racism, and violence. And you can see how legal and political mechanisms are triggered to sustain systematic violations. So through nationality, citizenship, migration, laws, and policies that render this population more vulnerable to legal precariousness and other violations and violence that can derive from that. And what I argue in my chapter is that the situation in the DER actually mirrors, in many ways, the legal and political migratory apparatus built in the US, and if you think more generally in the global North, which targets migrants coming from the global South. So that's my assertion. And to make my argument, I rely on two propositions. First, I propose that Juliet Stumpf's analytical framing of immigration, which has become quite popular concept, can to some extent illuminate the situation in the DR regarding the Dominican legal framework of exclusion and othering of migrants, particularly those of Haitian origin. And my second proposition is that it almost contradicts the first, but while immigration is a very useful concept that can illuminate this dialectic between north-south, south-south migration, in the end, what I suggest is that maybe we should depart from this narrow lens of state sovereignty and open up the examination to other how relationships of subordination, subjugation, and harm are reproduced according to post-colonial and current geopolitical interstate relations. So going a little bit beyond, and maybe by opening up this lens, we can think of other avenues and solutions to problems such as racism, violence, and the exclusion of migrants in the way that these structures are built. So in the end, I think the chapter speaks a lot about international human rights protection systems, which are the topic of my research. And even though they can turn, these diffuse structures of harm into more intelligible situations. For instance, if we look at the case law and you see through concrete cases how situations of violence affect specific individuals, and then we can, through that, elaborate concepts and understand a little bit better how racism affects specific populations. Even though this is very useful, what I argue in the chapter is that maybe we should go beyond that and shift our focus to how the migratory chain reaction works. So we can think about other ways to promote inclusion and foster resistance. So just to elaborate a little bit on a few of the key concepts. So what is crimmigration? The concept that Juliet Stumpf coined. Crimmigration denotes the encroachment of criminal law into immigration law. So both in terms of substance and also procedure. And I think the greatest example that we see is the increasing number of detention centers for asylum seekers, for instance. And from crimmigration, another interesting concept that was coined by Amada Armenta is racialized crimmigration, and she uses this term referring to the harmful effects of the migratory apparatus in the US on Dominican immigrants as a topic of growing concern here in the US. She speaks about how nearly 80% of unauthorized migrants in the US are of Mexican or Central American origin. And she suggests that a system of laws and law enforcement practices converge to reinforce Latino subordinate status in the racial hierarchy. And what I try to explore in the chapter through historical overview of the situation in the Dominican Republic is that we can see immigration and also racialized immigration that seems to occur in the DR as well. But in that context, it's against people of Haitian descent. So in that way, I start unveiling what I mean by the migratory chain reaction, and try to build this parallel. So just to provide a little bit of the context and of the historical overview that I go through in my chapter, I guess not only in the DR, but in Latin America in general, for centuries, white masters literally had property entitlements over Black slaves, meaning that human rights violations against individuals from African and of African descent were not seen as such, since their humanity was virtually not recognized, legally not recognized. And history really shows how deep and far-reaching colonial violence has perpetuated. If you look at Haiti right now, since colonial times to the present day, Haiti's geopolitical position has been strikingly underprivileged, extreme poverty, not to mention the environmental catastrophes and political instability. So unsurprisingly, there has always been the significant economic immigration, and Haiti and the DR share an island. And so there's been immigration from Haiti to DR historically, and racist migratory controls restrict the ascension of this historically marginalized group to power and perpetuate the systemic violence. So in the present day, Haitians are still detained, deported, excluded, beaten, and even killed through these legal mechanisms that render violations to their human rights sometimes invisible and make access to justice extremely difficult, especially if they're deprived of their Dominican nationality. At times, people of Haitian descent have been known to, through a series of legal events that have happened, deprived of their nationality, citizenship, and many of them have even been rendered stateless. And basically, the chapter tries to argue that discriminatory racist practices in the Caribbean can be construed as remnants of local habit, discontinued social practice, and persistent disavowal of humanity according to these categorizations and to law and policy. And that discrimination deriving exclusions take on very perverse shapes and features. I elaborate a little bit more on the chapter. And I try to bring, to highlight the fact that Dominican and Haitian societies were forcefully acquainted to these different modes of relationality that were introduced by European colonizers for centuries, starting with slavery that forced African diaspora until now, and it is still sustained. And these power relations, which organically ensued, are tainted by this, white slave owner legacy, whereby Black subalternity is shaped according to evolving socioeconomic relationships. And we can see also a reflection of that in the global North. Last month, I think many of you must have seen what happened at the border of Texas here, those very powerful images of US border control on riding horses with, whips, and then Haitian migrants trying and asylum seekers trying to enter the US, and in the media there was a lot of a parallel was made with, you know, this legacy that we unfortunately carry of slavery, and of the fact that we have not been able to disrupt this this tainted legacy. And so going back to my chapter, I think one of the questions that that stem from my reflections of the chapter is, how do we disrupt political and economic relationships that are shaped by economic and political interests of powerful and arguably wider elites, and perpetuate precariousness and vulnerability of racialized minorities, such as people of Haitian descent in the DR, or here in the US, you know, Latinos and also Haitians and other groups. And I propose 3 things for as further avenues of critical research. The first is to examine the ways the racialized migrant is shaped under this logic of illegality, and how the legal architecture is built to frame and punish particular types of subjectivity. And secondly, how that we should try to analyze how a globalized political economy feeds into this local context of vulnerability. And third, we can use the human rights framework. As I said, you know, you look at the case law of the Inter-American Court and you can see how many moral legal wrongs are being perpetrated, but we should also acknowledge that it's problematic given the neutral language of universality that often hides these historical power struggles that have artificially normalized unequal power relations in contemporary geopolitics. And just to wrap up, I want to leave you with a question. So how do we resist and we contest these dominant narratives by underscoring how migration is situated within deep-rooted genealogies of colonialism, racism, criminal law, migration law? How do we think about this differently? How do we transcend the narrow lens of thinking only within one state, to think about, you know, the chain reaction and interstate relations, different actors, non-state actors as well? And yeah, that's basically my intervention for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Very, very interesting presentation. Very, very kind of thought-provoking in terms of the subjects we're looking at. I'm now going to bring it back, first of all, to George and then to Pablo. I think George is going to tell us more about his own contribution, his own chapter in the book, and then we'll hand it over to Pablo to wrap up our coverage of the book. George, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Carolina. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see it. Oh, I think this is the wrong screen. Give me a second. I guess I have to move this here. No, give me one. I'm so sorry. Let me share the correct screen. I thought I had practiced this, but I guess I didn't. Okay, are you seeing one screen, or are you seeing 2?
One screen, it looks
okay,
fine.
Excellent, thank you. My name is Dr. George Radics, and I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology here at NUS. First off, I want to thank you, Andrew, for chairing this panel, and also to the Center for Asian Legal Studies for giving us the opportunity to share our work. And a big thank you to Julieta and to Carolina and to Jayson for showing up. I know the time zones are a little bit strange, and we're really grateful for your attendance. And thanks to Pablo for your years of support and your brilliance and your ideas that have made this project so successful. Today, I'm going to talk about my chapter, First World Problems in the Third World. Just to give you a little bit of background, when I came to Singapore as a postdoc in 2012, the anti-sodomy laws were being challenged. And we thought that perhaps this is an opportunity for the courts to step up and to be used as a venue to push for new rights. But many of you already know the story that the anti-sodomy law challenges were rejected by the Supreme Court in 2012 and again in 2018. But I will talk about the journey getting there. And at the end, I'll emphasize that the story is not exactly over, right? I didn't even get a chance to talk about the 2018 cases because this chapter was already in production at that point. So there's another chapter to be written. But let me just jump right into the discussion of my chapter and the title of the chapter. Many times when we talk about LGBT rights, particularly in Singapore, it's conceptualized as something that is Western, something that is external, and something that doesn't exist in Singapore, something that's imported. Like a first world problem, it's not something that is serious, because what is serious is economic development or physical security. I also take inspiration from Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, From Third World to First, where he talks about the journey of getting to the first world. We've abandoned these ideas of first world, second world, third world, and now we talk more about the global South. And I argue in this chapter that Singapore is part of the global South, as we saw with Jayson's chapter, and we also saw with Carolina's chapter that there are certain continuities that happen from the past to the present. And one of those continuities is that the anti-sodomy laws come from the British. They come from the colonial legacy, right? And so this tension of untangling what is Singaporean versus what is foreign is complicated, right? And when Section 377, the law criminalizing sex against the order of nature, was taken out of the penal code by the legislature back in 2007, a very long discussion on whether or not Section 377A, the law specifically criminalizing sodomy, should be repealed as well. And Lee Hsien Loong, in his speech, said, we can't deny that LGBT people are part of our history. They are our kith and our kin. But because of our Asian values, we must preserve these anti-sodomy laws, which is quite ironic because the anti-sodomy law was actually, based on a British law. But let me go through the order of my chapter. I start off by highlighting how LGBT movements in the West can be traced as far back as the beginning of the 20th century, and they kind of reached their zenith, or at least a breaking point in the 1960s with Stonewall. And this happened in New York City, but then it kind of rippled throughout the Western world. That wasn't exactly the story of Singapore, because in the 1960s, Singapore was a fledgling new nation that was grappling with racial riots, as well as the specter of the Vietnam War. And instead of providing political rights and civil rights, it was just struggling to provide economic security and physical safety for its citizens. So it wasn't until the 1990s that we saw LGBT citizens pushing for certain rights. And this is where we can talk a little bit about Lynette Chua's pragmatic resistance, where it was actually an NUS law student who wrote a letter to the police asking why the police were so hostile and aggressive during a recent bar raid in a gay bar. And the police actually responded with a letter that was respectful, saying, we don't really have a legal basis for this, and we're going to review our policies in the future. And that moment, that act, made the LGBT community in Singapore realize that if you don't antagonize the state or shame it or fight against it, but rather politely, respectfully ask for clarification, this can be a form of resistance, a pragmatic form of resistance. In the 2000s, we saw that the Singapore government started to kind of open up a little bit more and provide Singaporeans with more opportunities to speak up and to protest with Speaker's Corner, where you can apply for a permit to stand on your soapbox and speak your mind. So the LGBT community realized that they could take advantage of this new spot and apply for a permit so that they could wear pink to bring attention to LGBT issues. It became so successful that the Pink Dot is now the largest gay event in Asia, larger than gay pride parades in major cities throughout the region. But there was pushback, and when it became so large and it started to get sponsorship, corporate sponsorship from Facebook and Google and Barclays Bank and all these other multinational corporations, the Singapore government had to kind of pump the brakes and say, we need to protect our local cultural values and prevent foreigners from trying to import homosexuality or import LGBT identities. We also see challenges, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of this lecture in 2012, where Tan Hong, an individual who was caught and charged under Section 377A, the anti-sodomy law, and he challenged it in the Supreme Court. That challenge eventually failed, but one of the benefits was that it broadened the locus standi requirement, allowing for anyone who believes that the laws discriminate against them can challenge the law in the Supreme Court without actually having to be prosecuted under it. So in 2012, we had a second set of plaintiffs that challenged the law. Both cases were rejected. In 2018, we see 3 new cases, right? So there were some tangible benefits that came out of those challenges. Now, I end the chapter reflecting on the multiculturalism, the modernity, and the cosmopolitanism of Singapore. Much like the general population, the LGBT community is also multicultural, modern, and cosmopolitan, as well as grappling with issues of inequality. I start off this section by looking at a recent case where a gay couple went to the United States and used assistive reproductive technology, and through in vitro were able to have a child in the US. When they brought their child to Singapore, because they were 2 Singaporean males, and the government policy is, anti-gay and non-recognition of alternative family forms, the government rejected their request to have the child take on Singaporean citizenship, and it had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, okay, only in this case will we grant citizenship to this child, but not anymore, right? And how long will this judgment hold when you have straight heterosexual couples using the same technology as gay couples, and one group of people can take advantage of the technology and one group can't? We can also debate over whether or not there is such thing as Chinese privilege in Singapore, but the reality is the majority of the population is Chinese. And for minorities such as Malays, the way to conform is to conform through following the rules, the laws of Singapore. And if the law is anti-sodomy and that is parallel with certain teachings of Islam or certain interpretations of Islam, then to be a good Malay Singaporean is to also be anti-gay, right? And so we're starting to see homophobia in the Malay community, and we're starting to see how it's actually it's becoming more difficult to be gay and Malay in Singapore. And with transgender Singaporeans, much like all other Singaporeans, there is a bifurcation of the wealthy who can afford to do the sexual reassignment surgery if they choose to do so, can go to lavish and interesting poetry readings and other things. Whereas if you are a poor trans person who doesn't want to go through the sexual reassignment surgery, then you'll be discriminated against in the law as well as discriminated against in society. So I have another slide here on LGBT rights in Asia, which I will skip for the sake of time. But I do want to end on just a few notes of the recent developments. As I mentioned, this chapter was already in production when we started to hear the cases in November of 2019 from Johnson Ong, Brian Chong, and Roy Tan. They all stemmed from India's striking down of Section 377. I mentioned how that is the law that criminalizes sex against the order of nature, and it was stricken down in India with the help of NUS law grads. And as a result, Tommy Koh said, I would encourage our gay community in Singapore to bring a challenge to 377A. And when someone said, but we already did, he said, try again. And as a result, we had these 3 cases. These 3 cases were eventually disposed of and rejected in March of 2020. But it just goes to show you that the story isn't over. And yeah, and there's still things to be said about this topic. I'll end here. Thanks again for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, George. Fascinating at many levels, and obviously these issues are quite familiar to us here in Singapore. Thank you so much. So I'm now going to turn it over back to Pablo again, and I think he's going to tell us more about the creation of the book itself. So Pablo, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to take this opportunity to use the exposition of these 4 chapters to talk a bit about what the book is about, what we're trying to achieve, and what we thought that was important to publish this book. So as you can see, while the chapters, there's a lot of diversity, but they do talk, they have the kind of constructive dialogue. Clearly, both Julieta and Jayson, although they're talking about Argentina and Indonesia, they're talking about tensions and disputes to change the law, procedure, penal law. And what they found that is behind the underpinning discussions is a political discussion. It's also an institutional discussion. And I kind of differentiate that political and institutional in the sense that it is clearly even more clear in the case of Jayson that police there has a strong voice in the government and is trying to shape the system in a way that favors them. In the case of Julieta, she's talking, they're kind of like, there is a constant political struggle to move away from authoritarian paths into democracy. And this has been driven partially by this discourse of human rights. And then George and Carolina both kind of try to talk about citizenship, inclusion and exclusion, right? And it was also interesting in that is they can see how the complexity in terms of like what the role of the law plays in this inclusion and exclusion, and how it's been heavily so sectors of society or minorities we expect them to be more open for all the minorities. Actually, they weaponize that law, they weaponize that system in order to try to protect or create some kind of level of privilege, right? So so what does it say to me? Well, I think this is to say, so what are you going to find in this book? So on one side, what we're seeing here is what we're trying to do is nothing too original. We are still using Durkheim's approach to the law to try to read society through the law. So the law tells a lot about us, about how society is being organized and the cultural aspect of society. In another way, law is part of the culture, right? It's very peculiar, if you want, cultural artifact, because all the power that's invested, symbolic power that's invested in law, makes in a way more significant, more salient than others. So and when we're looking at the global south, what we kind of see this is a bit what Carolina was mentioning very openly, is the geopolitics, right? So we have a material reality in which all these forms of symbolic power are being rested upon. And that material reality is heavily shaped by the international division of labor that we can call, we talk about colonial legacies, but actually the persistence of these colonial legacies, we need to interrogate that. Why is that the persistence of these colonial legacies? And the persistence of these colonial legacies, a bit what George was mentioning about economic aspect of Singapore, what Carolina was talking about, the economic connections and relationships between United States and Latin America, and between Haiti and Dominican Republican, we see that there is a material reality there that are very concrete, in which all this symbolic power rests. So in the book, what you see is all these chapters, they try to interrogate what is behind the law. What is behind the law? What are we finding here? There's a recognition of that historical legacy. But more important than that is they try to interrogate what is the power dynamic, that current power dynamic that sustains that legacy. And I think that is very important, because sometimes, and I think this is what very clearly none of the chapters or contributions do. Sometimes there's a tendency to overly focus on the legacy and just try to blame our present for what happened with the British Empire or the Spanish Empire hundreds of years ago, without actually interrogating how the local ruling elites have weaponized that particular legacy and continuously use them for their own sake. So are all the chapters, and a bit what Jayson was talking about, how is that currently the conflict, the clashes in the street, talking in the Indonesia streets. All our chapters talk about something that is very present, very and is continuously being challenged, contested, a bit like George, Julieta were talking about. This is something ongoing struggles, mobilizing different type of support. And if something is very clear in the Global South, I would say that it's the same in the Global North, but it's more clear in the Global South, is things are chaotic, they're messy. So a bit what Josh was talking about, what is the role of Malay and the Malay culture when we're talking about gays' rights, and how is that when, even if we try to decolonize the law, decolonize, what we need to ask, what is actually going to be the outcome of that decolonization? Because they are very different, very potentially very different outcomes for that decolonization, right? And what exactly decolonization means. I think that it is very clear for the chapters that when we think about decolonization for us means to emancipation of the people, empowerment of the people. Decolonization can never could be just merely a change of masters, right? And I think this is very important, because there are some dangerous understanding of decolonization that actually just empower. There are strong objections about Asian values, for example, as a potential to what extent the emancipatory power of that concept. That's one example of this. There's a strong objections about sovereignty, which Carolina was talking about. She's saying, well, maybe it's not enough just to try to empower the states of the Global South, like Republican Dominican, because what we need to look is going beyond the sphere of the state. Because at the end of the day, the state is just the condensation of the relations of forces of that particular state, right? And that is still being, it has to be contested too. So I think the chapters we're trying to say is that if it's going to be meaningful, the discussion of the Global South, if it's not just going to repeat empirical work of what's happening in Global South, what we're looking here is not necessarily finding a new theory. Julieta is using cosmology theories that have been developed in the Global North. Carolina is using the communication that's developed in the Global North. We are not trying to break from all our tradition of social science that can produce a very strong analytical tools. That doesn't mean that we cannot innovate, but we recognize the power of social science itself. But what here is the political content and direction of that has to be clear. And I think this is what all the chapters in the books are trying to do, are trying to talk about the oppression, and they're trying to see how that oppression could be redeemed, how could we overcome, how can this understanding of the people can develop a cultural dynamic that is not necessarily a repetition of the colonial legacy, a repetition of the power asymmetries that have been for so many years been imposed. And I think in that sense they are quite successful, because they are, I think the point sometimes is not necessarily to offer a solution, but to clearly identify that the vicious circle that we are into, I thought what's really interesting that George, Carolina, Jayson, Julieta, they all talk about human rights, and they don't feel there's a dangerous trend sometimes that we reject human rights as just a Western imposition. And I think this is we should be able to interrogate human rights discourse without denying or rejecting human rights as a way of trying to empower individuals. Again, going back to my point, to try to emancipate people. So I thought that was what we tried to achieve in this book. What we're trying to achieve with this dialogue is not moving away, it's not isolating, it's not excluding other voices. Quite the opposite, is to bring voices in a clear idea that more people can talk and we can hopefully improve. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Very interesting perspectives, and I'm sure there'll be questions about what you just said. So thanks to everybody, wonderful presentations and incredibly creative and thought-provoking too. So now we can turn it over to the floor, and just a reminder that your questions, please use the Q&A button to raise your questions, and so that everybody understands what the question is. I will then read it out before we get an answer, and remember to say to whom your question is directed. And perhaps while you're considering your questions, I'll use my prerogative in the chair to raise the first one. And this is, I think, quite a difficult question, but it maybe follows on from what Pablo was talking about, but I'll direct it to both Pablo and to George. When you move from considering criminal legalities in the global north to the global south, I just wonder if we can be a little bit clear about what changes, if anything, in that process. Obviously, you know, the geographical location changes, the context will change. But if I understand what Pablo was saying correctly, we don't necessarily change our theoretical approach. I'm not sure about methodology. Maybe you want to say something about that, but perhaps also the focus of our concerns might change. And you've emphasized here colonialism as the sort of, you know, the binding element in the global south that we're kind of addressing in this book. But, you know, even in the global north too, people address colonialism. So I wonder if either of you or both of you could comment a little bit further on this question of what is it that changes when you move from the global north to the global south?
Should I go or you want to go, George? Okay, Andrew, that is such a good question. I will try to say, I think the key point here, I will say the first point here, I think the key point here is about intensity. So when we talk about the global south, what we can see is that the models that we use to understand society and the kind of like assumptions that we have society in terms of the division or between economics and politics and division of different institutional divisions, the differentiation of individuals in terms of the class and the position. I think when we go to the global south, it's very clear there are more porosity, it's much more chaotic. And that is because the way modernity has been developed, when it came to the global south, and because of the position of the global south in terms of the mode of accumulation and the type of exploitation that has, it has created much more tensions, more clear tensions to understand. And these tensions are evident in, let's say, one concept that is very clear, which is state violence. So when we see about the state level of state violence that people in the global south have to suffer, I'm thinking the Philippines, I'm thinking Indonesia, I'm thinking Argentina, I'm thinking anywhere, you can see that although state violence still exists in the global north, it manifests differently. So activism in Colombia, activism in Mexico, activism against palm oil industry in Indonesia means a really clear threat of being assassinated. Well, if you do that same activism in Norway, in Sweden, or in Denmark, it will be much more difficult, although it may happen, like happened in Malta, it happens in other places, it will be more difficult. It's a question about intensity that is undeniable of that violence. And that intensity is because the idea of weak state that we usually have when we talk about the global south in terms of the regulation and the capacity to control, let's say police, as Jayson was talking about, let's say with Carolina, the example of Carolina, how Haitians, cremigation in Dominican Republic is very different from cremigation in the United States, because cremigation in Republic of Dominica may be like you being kidnapped by police and disappear, and no one even talks about that. So that intensity of the state violence has to do also with particular material relations there in terms of how the accumulation process and the role the state has played. And when we talk about weak state, mostly what we're talking about is a very functional state for some predatory politics that are being constantly reproduced in the global south. So the plantation requires a certain level of exploitation of people, like always only being possible to reproduce, maintain with certain level of corruption by the state and violence against any form of resistance. So I think that my take with the global south will be is that what we're talking about is not just about the legacy, it's about how neocolonialism playing there now in terms of reproducing these conditions of asymmetries of power and inequality.
Yeah, and if I agree with everything that Pablo says, obviously, but I think just to add on that, and I think you raised a great point, Andrew, about methods. I think one of the things that is a strength of this compilation is that many of the scholars are young scholars from the regions that they are writing about. This is very different from just like popping into a place for a few months to extract data and write something. We live in the regions that we write about, and I think that impacts how you see things. But also just the way in which, and this echoes what Pablo was saying, the way in which rights are conceptualized in the West is very different from the way in which rights are conceptualized in the global South. I mean, when we talk about the Westphalian order and how modern states emerged to protect the rights of citizens, to respect those individual communities, borders in the global South were many times imposed inorganically upon people. And you know, people were always moving across borders, and then now you have these lines that just emerge. And you know, not to plug our next book, but we do have another book where you know, we're talking about rights in that context. And again, echoing what Pablo said, in that book, we're focusing primarily on minorities. And in that case, when we talk about human rights, it's like we're not even focusing on rights. We're not even focusing on particular categories of individuals. Pablo and I tried to recruit chapters on gender and sexuality and race, but those categories don't really work as well in the global South, because the global South is so much more, I don't want to say chaotic, but I mean, it is a little bit more messy, and maybe that's the beauty of studying the South, that there's so much more diversity, and things aren't as clear cut, and they don't fall into the same categories that we're used to. But I think when we look at the global South, there's just so much to study, and for those of us who live in the places that we research, or who come from these places that we study, there's a different level of attachment to the issues and a different perspective that we can bring.
Thanks so much to both of you. That's incredibly enlightening responses. That's really wonderful. We still don't seem to have any questions from the audience, which I find very surprising, but okay. Let's then just move on to another question that really kind of follows from what you said. Let's ask that, what is always the very awkward "so what" question. I mean, so let's assume that we agree with everything that you say. Where do we take the issues from there? And in particular, what sort of research? I mean, you've opened up, there may be many possibilities. What sort of research would you like to see this book inspiring? More of the same, or do you have other ideas about it?
Maybe I can start, and then Pablo can and add his thoughts as well. I think that the idea with this book and with all of our projects so far has been to try to present alternative viewpoints and viewpoints that aren't always considered, either because they are published in a different language or because they're engaging in different discussions that don't necessarily emerge in the Northern academies and American universities. And I think that there is some freshness to these ideas to hopefully encourage others to view rights and law and criminal law in a different way, not necessarily to take the same models and the same constructs and to apply them in a cookie cutter way to different societies, but to try and envision and imagine different conceptualizations of rights and law. And I will say that, I was really, in the next book, I was really inspired by Carolina's chapter on crimmigration, which was from Juliet Stumpf in Oregon, was talking about the American experience, but how it manifests in the global South is so fundamentally different, and I think that is the exciting thing that we're doing. We're not necessarily rejecting categories from the North, but we're just seeing how they manifest, how they influence, how they change in different contexts, and how we can assert new concepts as well.
Great. Okay, we have a question. This, sorry, it's not a question. It's an apology from Stanley for having to leave. But what a shame! I was looking forward to a question from Stanley Yo. Okay, all right. Since I seem to be having to perform the function of audience as well as moderator, there was one other question that occurred to me. When Pablo was talking about, the persistence of colonialism. As somebody who works on law in Asia, one of the things that always strikes me is the extraordinary persistence of foreign law, of European laws, common law, civil law across Asia, even sometimes as in the case of Indonesia, in the face of a sort of a strong push to kind of get rid of the colonial law. So on the one hand, we've got this incredible and almost sort of baffling degree of persistence of colonial law. But it seems, according to what I'm hearing in this seminar, it goes much further than that. It's persistence of things that the law represents. And that is maybe even more worrying than the persistence of law itself, because I mean, laws can be gradually changed, they can be interpreted in different ways. But if what is persisting is the reasons why those laws exist in the first place, then we seem to have a much larger problem than I imagined that we have. So I just wonder if you have any responses to that thought, either of you, or any of the other presenters. I'll just throw that open for anybody to respond. If you want to respond, just unmute yourself.
If no one is,
okay,
I will take the lead. I think that's a magnificent question, because I'm pretty difficult to answer in a way, because I believe one of the key points here is that we keep talking about the law, and that's why you use legalities. We keep talking about the law as if it was something easy to identify and kind of an object distinct from cultural norms and daily practices. But actually, when we go to the field, we find that that's not the case, right? So it's the reasons why, at least from my point of view, the reason why I think you're right in a sense. There is more than just the law. What is and when we interrogate why are these laws, we're going to find a number of answers. But I guess one of them is that we need to recognize that those laws have constructed certain type of power structures that have benefited certain groups of the population, and they are keep using the law. That's why we're saying that the continuance of colonialism is that there are certain local ruling elites that are just taking advantage of structures of asymmetry that were deployed or set before. That is one point. Another point, I do believe the law has certain specificities and a certain inertia that because of the role it looks in terms of tradition and conservative. So it's not as easy to create a cultural change as other elements. A bit what Julieta was talking about Argentina. Although the cosmology has changed, although there is a very strong consensus about certain idea of human rights, certain type of democracy, the law tends to resist changes. Not just because of the people, but because of the very same structure of the law that is meant to do that. It's meant to resist change. It's meant to consent society to equality. So I think that's another point.
Right, thank you so much. That's very interesting. Well, somewhat belatedly, we now have not just one, but two questions. So great, thank you so much. So the first one is from an old friend of ours, Gary Lee, and this question is for Jayson and Julieta. One of the fascinating threads across your presentations and chapters is the way that legal procedure and process become objects of post-colonial contestation. How might you explain the significance of procedure in contrast to other potential sites or areas of legal mobilization in decolonization? So Jayson and then Julieta.
Okay. In the Indonesian context, the code of criminal procedure was significant historically, because, as I said, the Dutch thought the best way to control a population was simply to install a strong government. You didn't need a sophisticated system of rights, and this translates in terms of the philosophy behind the procedure. So in colonial times, no, this is true for most Latin American countries, if not all of Latin American countries, in the Philippines to in Indonesia. The preferred philosophy was an inquisitorial system, and when the states decolonized, they had an opportunity to abrogate that system and accept a more modern one that is based on balancing the rights of individuals vis-a-vis other individuals and the state, something that is more adversarial. But in Indonesia, just at the times decolonizing, the state was authoritarian, and it served the colonial philosophy was preserved because it served the interest of authoritarianism, and authoritarianism really didn't end. So with the the change of government from Sukarno to Suharto. This was preserved. The main ideas were preserved, and in the democratic era, the philosophy became so identified with national identity that in effect, colonialism became part of national identity, but given a new presentation as nationalism and integralism. So this is why it's important, at least in Indonesia. Sure, Julieta will have more to say.
Okay, Julieta, just 1 minute, please, because we've got another question.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It's a really big question, but just to say something different from Jayson, we can see also this post-colonial contestation as a flag in the struggle for the reform and in the movement, in the mobilization of law and in the discourses of the reformers. And also it's important to take into account the movement of importation and exportation of law in many situations. For example, Argentina also export law from Central America or other countries in Latin America. So this is also a kind of way of being the law and the development of law, just to provocate a little bit about this issue. And also about this translation of law to a part, to a country to another, this movement from center to periphery also has a part of novelty in this movement. It's not so black or white. I think we need, to see more the complexity about this issue of colonialism with law. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's just quickly move to Winona's question. Given that there is no one-size-fits-all solution and the difficulties of decolonizing, how do we meaningfully learn from the South? What would be the main takeaway? I'm not sure to whom that is being directed, Winona, but let's leave it open to see who wants to respond to that.
Maybe I can answer that quickly. And I noticed that there is a question for Carolina as well. So I'll just really quickly say that, I think we tend to put certain interpretations of law on a pedestal. Like we have the rule of law initiative from the United States kind of exporting an interpretation of law. Also, we have to remember that human rights debates many times only look at interpretations of law that stem from kind of Western histories. And lastly, I think by looking at the Global South, we can perhaps think of more imaginative, creative, and flexible ways to train lawyers, not just in our context in this Global South, but also in the Global North. I studied and practiced law in the Global North, and it's almost like you have blinders on, and you're not really thinking about outside of your jurisdiction, but perhaps there are things to learn in terms of how we can come to more creative solutions for some problems. But maybe we can allow Carolina to end us on the final question. It's a complex one.
Yeah, thanks, George. So the question is about to elaborate on the history of immigration in the Dominican Republic. I'm not sure I would be the best person to do that. I'm not a historian, but I do have a section on my chapter that elaborates a little bit on that for the purposes of what I'm trying to argue. But what I can say, and then I think it also stems from reflecting on what George and Pablo were saying earlier about importing this global North concepts to apply to Southern contexts. which is that, you know, in the global South, we can think obviously about, you know, the laws and legal evolution, but the chaos and the intensity of chaos translates into a lot of a higher level of lawlessness that we tend to live in this context as well. And I think one of the most interesting things, besides looking at the criminal-regulatory legal mechanisms, is also to see how it translates into how law is respected or not, and what are the different practices that unfold from that. So also picking up on Andrew's last question of how should we further research on in the South, I think ethnographic work is really important, because if you only look at the law, it just paints a picture that's not the reality. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that because of time as well. But thank you for the question. Maybe we can talk later via email and further this conversation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And thanks for some very, very interesting questions. I think the obvious conclusion is that we just need to know more about these issues. And I think you've all laid down a fantastic foundation for future work to be done. And Gary's question is clearly one that can be pursued. So sadly, we have to draw to a close, because you know, I see our director appearing, and I think that's a reminder that, you know, we're past the 7:30 deadline. So I just want to thank everybody. I know some of you, you know, are appearing here in the early morning where you are. So I hope there hasn't been too much of a hardship for you, but we're very grateful for your contributions. And again, congratulations to George and Pablo and everybody involved in the book for your great product, and we look forward to more. Thank you so much.